Prologue. 21st of Romlia, 346 AG. 0900, Black Knight, Base 21. The sky was gray and overcast over the Kaldur Mountains of northern Canrom. The wind blew lightly over the land and rustled the lush trees and vegetation that filled the area. Small flowers had bloomed in the grass and trees, for the month of Romlia, the summer month, had come and was already 3 weeks in. While the world was bustling with life around them, the inhabitants of Black Knight Base 21 had taken the day to mourn the loss of two of their own, Jeff Skaven and Krynan Jameso.
"He was a good soldier,"
Captain Brand, the hulking white-haired and single-eyed Gaian, announced to the crowd of mourners that stood before him. His voice rang out over the silence like thunder over the sea.
"Krynan was young, quiet. He was strong. The boy had his life ahead of him. It is truly a shame that we lost him the way we did."
Behind Bran was a stone altar with a flame burning on top of it. Krynan's sword and chest piece rested at the foot of the altar. His sword had been found in the weld. His armor had been left behind in the Isla Axi caverns. The mourners looked on with faces that were mostly devoid of emotion. They had all grown accustomed to death, numb to it. Only those that were close to Krynan showed visible signs of pain.
"I wish there were more we could have done,"
Bran reflected as he lowered his head.
"I wish he could have continued to fight with us. I suppose the reality now is that he has given us another reason to fight. The reason being that this fight was never in vain, that his memory will live on."
A middle-aged male Human and dark-haired she-elf stood behind the towering Gaian captain. The man, Commander Krynan Jameso Sr., had his arm wrapped around his wife's shoulders. She stood silently with her arms crossed and head lowered. A furious look was painted onto her face.
"Lord Krynan, would you like to say a few words?"
Bran asked, turning to the two. Commander Krynan looked at his wife and squeezed her shoulder. He let go and stepped forward. Bran looked at Commander Krynan, who stood 1.5 feet below his eye level, and placed his massive hand on Krynan's back.
"I'm sorry, old friend."
Commander Krynan nodded at him, and Bran stepped back and stood next to Krynan's wife. Commander Krynan stood for a moment and stared at the ground before him in silent deliberation. He looked at the mourners before him, and they waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. Finally, he sighed and spoke. "What does a man say?" Commander Krynan asked, his voice aged but smooth. "What does a man say at his son's funeral?" He bit his lip and nodded his head again. "As many of you know, Krynan is not the first child I have lost. My first daughter and eldest son both went missing long ago. Ladia and I pray that they still breathe. While we may hold on to even the slightest shred of hope for them, I fear that my son Krynan's fate is decided." He wiped a tear away from his eye and cleared his throat. "Krynan was very much like his mother," he said with a chuckle. "Kind of an asshole." The mourners laughed, for many of them knew the younger Krynan's reputation. He did not like to be looked at, touched, or spoken to, and he always had a sharp word or a balled fist for those who tried. He always preferred to be left alone. Commander Krynan looked back at his wife and saw that, however faint, a half-smile had momentarily formed on her face. He knew she would probably rip his ear off later for his comment, but making her smile was worth the lashing he would undoubtedly receive. "I remember when he was young," Commander Krynan continued. "He was a little fireball. He would always get into fights with his elder siblings. Nothing was too big for him." Krynan laughed as a memory popped in his mind. "Why, I remember one time I took his toy sword away. He punched me square in the dick." The mourners laughed again, and so did Krynan. "By the brothers, I loved that kid." Krynan's face briefly wrinkled up with sadness. "I will always love that kid. You see, behind that hard exterior, behind those walls that he built for himself, was the most beautiful heart. He felt so much deeper and harder than any of my other children. He experienced the world differently than the rest of us. He protected animals from his brother Kirsten, protected his twin brother from His brother Kirsten. He would always snuggle up in my or Lydia's arms at the end of the day. When we would kiss the top of that thick-haired head, he would try to burrow deeper. My son loved being loved. He hated showing that love, though. That is something I can forgive. Crinan sighed deeply and looked out at everyone. Well, I have done my best. I have not always been there for my children, the commander admitted with sorrow in his voice. I wish things could have been different. Had I been able to be there to protect them, Sarah, Kirsten, had I been there with Crinan, I would have given every breath I had to protect him. He sighed and tears fell down his face. It's why I fight this damned war. To make a better world for my children. It is why I cannot stop. Anger spread across his face for a moment, and he paused to compose himself. Another day, another death, right? He seethed, digging deep within himself to find the kind of words a leader needed to say. This time it was my son. So what must a man do? Do I lay down? Submit? Do I give up? Commander Crinan trembled with fury and passion. His eyes were ablaze with fervor, and he swept his gaze over the assembled soldiers in front of him. As his lip curled into a snarl, he took a mighty step forward and pounded his fist against his chest. Fuck no! He began to speak faster and more furiously. The battle isn't any less won or any more lost with the death of my son or Jeff Skaven. We now have an even deeper responsibility to keep fighting, to win. We fight for true freedom. For those that hate us, we fight. For those who think that they are already free, we fight. We fight for our sons, for our daughters and grandchildren, our husbands and wives. We fight for those fighting next to us. My son died. Yes, and I will never forget that boy. And I will make damn sure that my sword cuts down 100 other father sons if that's what it takes to free this world from Govia's grasp. The mourners nodded and some clapped or cheered. Commander Crinan turned to his wife and looked at her for a moment, and then back to the crowd. Today we remember Jeff and my son and all the others who have fallen to protect our way of life. Today we mourn. Tomorrow, we pick up our swords and we shove them through the hearts of all who stand in our way. We will cut down every Govian who would ever dare think of getting in our way. Captain Brand stepped forward and pumped his massive fist into the air.
For Crinan!
He bellowed, returning his thunderclap of a voice for all to hear. The mourners returned his shout with one of their own.
For Crinan!